bringing it back to Singapore. Prime Minister Lee visited Australia and was highlighting Singapore's balancing act between the U.S. and China. And he also had some comments on the U.S. Chip curb, etc. Give us the overview of what exactly he said while he was in Australia and how that led to this chip comment.
Well, I think so. This highlights how U.S.-China and the what is certainly heading down the path of a Cold War 2.0 is just going to override everything in the region. Here you have a Singapore, Australia, high-level visit. It's the 7th annual leaders meeting. There's such good relations politically, diplomatically, economically between the Singapore and Australia, and how important that relationship is. Yet it's overshadowed by what's going on between the U.S. And China. And it highlights the balancing act that Singapore is doing and is going to get even more difficult between the U.S. and China. For example, on the CPTPP, the most important trade agreement in Asia Pacific, certainly the most high-level trade agreement in Asia Pacific, which the U.S. abandoned under President Trump and will not come back to, doesn't seem, under President Biden, but China wants in.
Yeah.
And Australia has made, very clear through its statements with from their trade minister, said that the trade minister for Australia says, I don't see any prospect that China could join CPTPP. Why is that? Because China, one, doesn't live up to its commitments in international trade agreements, as we've seen. You've seen China take aggressive action against Australia when Australia says we want a full investigation of COVID. And then China says, oh, by the way, no more wine from Australia into our country. So Australia doesn't want China into CPTPP. But what does Prime Minister Lee say when he's there? He said, I think it's a good thing if China were able to join CPTPP. So you see the tensions and the balancing act, even when you have those relationships between Singapore and Australia.
And also, I'm interested to know, they're doing this agreement, or they've signed this agreement on a bilateral relationship about connectivity and data security. I personally find that fascinating, the one between Singapore and Australia, because there was a recent breach of security. Optus, which was a phone network I used when I lived in
millions of records
of Australia. And of course, it's Singtel owned.
Yep.
So there are close connectivity data issues there with Australia and Singapore already. So it's quite significant development, Steve.
Yeah, I mean, and you saw also that Singapore and Australia signed Singapore's first ever green economy agreement. So a lot that is going on bilaterally between Singapore and Australia, but it's still going to be, if not overshadowed, you're going to have different views of Australia on how to deal with China, from the U.S. on how to deal with China, and Singapore on how to deal with China. And all of that is just going to make this balancing act so much better. So yeah, you're still going to see strong relations, of course, between Singapore and Australia on green economy, on data security. But what's going to happen when it comes to trade, like on CPTPP? What's going to happen when the U.S. puts in restrictions on microchips, and it's going to get you're going to see more restrictions coming, and that's going to impact Singapore. It's going to impact the EU. It's going to impact everybody. And so it's just going to overshadow the U.S.-China competition, and confrontation is going to overshadow almost everything now.
And just briefly, the Prime Minister Lee, mentioned that the U.S. chip curb could have wide-ranging ramifications. Take us through what he was talking about there.
Well, I mean, the U.S. has made clear in the National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, said in a speech that the U.S. must maintain as large a lead as possible when it comes to China and technology superiority, and that the U.S. is going to be much more active in preventing China from making progress on semiconductors and it will soon be other key technologies, because the U.S. has seen that China has become more aggressive internationally and more repressive at home. And if China gets access to the type of technology, it's going to use it to become even more aggressive internationally and more repressive domestically. And so the U.S. is now putting restrictions on. And those restrictions impact everybody. When the U.S. says you can't have U.S. persons working on, certain chips that go to China, they could be working for Singapore companies, these U.S. citizens or U.S. PRs. They can now not work for a Singapore company if Singapore is going to be doing this type of business in China. When you integrate everything together, all the products together, it better not have U.S. technology if it's going to China. And so that's going to impact Singapore companies. It's Singapore.
And the Prime Minister came out very widely and said, he said, quote, this could create a less stable world.
And he went further. It can have very wide ramifications. I'm assuming he's referring to Singapore there, as well as the other countries in the region.
And again, this is where the U.S. is going to disagree with him, where the U.S. is saying, we're doing this because this decoupling is going to create a more stable world. If we allow China,
he said.
No, I'm saying, but this is where you have two different views on where China is in the world order, and you have two different views on what constitutes national security. And this is where Prime Minister Albanese said, took the U.S. view, said national security is not just about defense systems. It's about our capacity to make things. And from his perspective, it's how do you make things in Australia? How are you going to be less vulnerable to shocks when it comes to cybersecurity or what it might be, and whether it could be in an international conflict? So what the Prime Minister of Australia says and what the U.S. is saying and doing are more aligned, and where Prime Minister Lee is looking at it from a globalization perspective and the economic perspective, saying this decoupling is going to lead to a less stable world when you don't have that integration between the two largest economies, which of course is the U.S. and China.
Let's pick. Sorry,
I'm just going to say, Steve, a more existential question maybe. Where does this end? I mean, neither side have made it clear they have no intentions of backing down anytime soon. Where does this end?
I mean, you need to ask what policies is China going to take? What is Xi going to do when he gets his third term, and which could end up being a fourth term and a fifth term, because like the UK changed all its rules, the Communist Party in China changed its rules and now says you don't have a 2-term limit to be party secretary. So what does this mean? You have to ask, what is China's reaction going to be? What are other countries' reactions going to be? You overlay this with what's going to happen in the South China Sea, what's going to happen with Taiwan, and what's the future of cross-straits relations. So it is becoming, in Prime Minister Lee's terms, no doubt, we are now in a less stable world, and this is going to have impacts from an economic perspective, a business perspective, a defense perspective, and certainly a bilateral and multilateral relationship.